Now, the Tories have announced an inquiry into how we can do more for our children, following a UNICEF report which found that British kids have the lowest level of well-being among young people in the industrialised world. Well, in the papers this morning, talk of how this is now a key issue, dividing the political parties, with Labour looking at closer monitoring of our children and the Tories advocating a reduced role for the state and more support for marriage. Well, also today, reports that we're now facing an epidemic of teenage mums. So what should we all be doing about this?
We're joined by Tim Montgomery, an influential Tory who thinks there should be many more tax incentives for marriage, and a Labour supporter who doesn't, Fiona Miller, former number 10 advisor and chair of the National Family and Parenting Institute. Tim, why should people be bribed to get married or stay married?
Well, I think what we have in Britain at the moment is an absolute crisis in childhood. We know that our children are not growing up anywhere near as well as we would like them to do. And I think over the last 10 years of the Labour government, and I would say over Tory governments previously, there has been no support for marriage. There's been no support for the institution that all of the evidence shows is the safest, secure environment for children to grow up within.
That's true, though, isn't it? It is shown that marriage actually is the best way of looking after, of bringing up children.
Well, obviously two parents can be better than one, but that's not to say that a lot of lone parents don't do a great job, and we all know people who have done a great... And I happen to be an unmarried mother with the same partner of 27 years standing, and I take exception to the idea that I've been any less good as a parent because of that. The question is that there is evidence that shows that people don't get married, they don't stay together as long. I mean, my question to Tim would be, how do you know that those same people, if they were forced to get married, would stay together? Because there may be something about the transient nature of relationships and the way people go into having children.
Tim, because it's true, when you had the married couples tax allowance, divorce rates in the 60s and 70s, that was when divorce rates really started to go up. So where's the evidence that for a few quid people will stay together in a marriage?
Well, the evidence is actually in the incredibly complex maze of a benefit system that Gordon Brown has created, because there are actually 200,000 lone mothers who actually aren't lone mothers in Britain at the moment. They are actually cohabiting with a partner, but because of the benefit system, which actually discourages people to live together, they are actually having to live a lie and away from what should be a natural sort of situation with a man that they love.
Right, Fiona, this is a point often made by
tightening up fraud in the benefit system. I'm all in favour of that, but I think that's a slightly different point to whether, A, you can incentivise marriage. Marriage has been on a decline since the early 70s, in spite of what the Tories did in the 80s. It didn't make any difference. Whether it's right for politicians...
The Tories didn't do anything in the 80s, though, really.
But you did have tax incentives. There was a lot of rhetoric about marriage.
Small, though.
Whether politicians can and should be telling people how they should lead their lives.
It's not about telling people how they should live. Most people want to get married in Britain. The aspiration to marry is very strong, but there is very little encouragement from it. There's a lot of expense in getting...
Isn't part of this, though, at least at the heart of the problem, that you do get young men who think it's all right to father children with many different mothers? And I mean, the Conservatives struggle with this, but Labour in a decade in power has not cracked...
If they got married, they may just have multiple partners and
well, it might say to them, you have to make a commitment to another person if you're going to bring children into the world.
I don't think the act of getting married would necessarily change the personal characteristics in those young couples. There is a wider issue about the way people enter relationships, the seriousness with which they take having children. And I think one of the good things that come out of this debate is we're now talking about the effect it has on kids when relationships do break down, the longer-term effects it can have on their educational attainment and so on, and that came through Ian Duncan-Smith's reports. That's a good thing. But the answer, I think, will not be in trying to use the tax system to incentivise marriage, but to prevent couples from breaking down, helping them support their relationships when they get into difficulties, and not doing anything that will harm the children. And some of the changes, it does worry me that you might be thinking of changing the benefit system and it will harm the children, not the parents.
Tim, the new kind of touchy-feely Cameron era, a lot of Tory modernisers might be a bit worried by this idea that we're going to harking back to basics, back to marriage. Are we really sending out the right signal?
Well, I don't think David Cameron is sort of, a traditionalist in the old sense, in that when he made his speech at party conference last year saying that marriage was important, he also said that the Conservative Party and he supported same-sex partnerships. This is not a sort of move back to those back-to-basics times. What it is acknowledging that within Britain at the moment we have an epidemic of crime, we have an epidemic of family breakdown, we have a lot of social problems, child poverty getting worse, that the Labour measures are not succeeding in tackling. What David Cameron is saying is a very grown-up approach to this. He doesn't know what votes are in it, but he's saying we have a crisis, let's try and start to rebuild the family.
And
I think that's
I think we have to be very careful not to talk about these crises. I mean, there is a crisis in some families' lives, and some children are encountering great difficulties. Lots of children are fine, they're doing very well, lots of parents are doing well, they're achieving at school. There is a crisis in parts of our society, but the idea that the whole society is going to hell in a handcart, all kids are demonised, all parents are terrible, is, I think, dangerous, because there's a lot of good out there and we need to be celebrating that as well.
One thing that this doesn't really take into account is that there's the idea of single mothers. It's a bit of a simplistic term because it looks at such a very wide range of women, talking about women who've been in a relationship for a very long time, in a committed relationship. And today we've seen a very, very high rate of teenage pregnancies. 1 in 50 kids in some areas, of women in some areas of the UK, underage, having a baby. Surely that is where these resources should be targeted, not asking couples whether or not they should be married if they've been together for 10, 15 years.
Well, there's not one sort of magic policy to tackle these problems. If the Conservative Party only had a family policy that was a tax break for marriage, I couldn't support that. What David Cameron, he set up on Monday, a wide-ranging inquiry into the problems of childhood. And they're going to look at things like the support the extended family can give to single mothers of the kind that you described, to talk about the advertising pressures from commercial TV on children, to talk about the lack of playing space for children to enjoy and become properly rounded children. So there'll be a broad family policy from the Conservative Party, but it should include support for marriage.
Fiona, why hasn't Labour been able to do anything about these teenage pregnancy rates?
I think it's very complicated, and there are cycles of family deprivation. That is certainly true, and the answers are not simplistic, like just saying get married. It's to do with education. It's a lot of it's to do with aspiration and educational attainment. But I mean, even achieving educational attainment is very difficult in families where they don't aspire to do well, where education isn't important, where maybe they've had generations who haven't had a job and so on. I think it is very difficult, and the roots of it are in terms of educating parents and also more support in schools. To help parents to help their children.
Fiona Miller, Tim Montgomery, thank you both for joining us this morning.